The influence of the war in Ukraine continues to spread in a bipolar direction. Two Russian cities close to the borderlines. The two massive offensive operations carried out by the Free Russian Legion groups on the city of Belgorod, located on the northern border of Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast, were the first stage of this leap. The second phase was drone attacks, explosions, and massive fires in Russian cities around the Crimean peninsula. Moscow is suffering a massive cross-border attack and drone strikes, including the Krasnodar oil refineries in southern Russia and a fuel depot near a strategic bridge connecting Russia's mainland with Crimea. Unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to Kiev are hitting Russian logistics, ammunition depots, oil facilities, and Russian formations in these regions. The fact that Kiev organizes attack operations in these areas with unmanned aerial vehicles causes alarm bells to ring in the Kremlin. Earlier yesterday, drones attacked the Yakovlivka oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar Krai. Dramatic footage of flames reaching the skies at a Russian oil refinery has surfaced online after Russian authorities reported that the country had carried out a drone attack on two oil facilities in the Krasnodar region. Huge flames were seen in videos circulating online that reportedly showed the fire at the Yakovlivka facility. The governor of the region, Veniamin Kondratiev, announced on Telegram that a drone attacked the Yakovlivka oil refinery in southwest Russia during the night, causing a fuel distillation unit to catch fire. The fire broke out in an area of 100 meters squared. The fire was extinguished as a result of the efforts of the Russian emergency teams who came to the scene. The Yakovlivka oil refinery is located in the south of Russia, not far from the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. The port of Novorossiysk was the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet until the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Since then, Russia has transferred the headquarters to the occupied port city of Sebastopol. But since this decision, both Crimea and Russian cities near the peninsula have become centers of drone attacks. On the same day as the attack on the Yakovlivka oil refinery in Krasnodar Krai, a second incident was reported by the Russian authorities at the Ilsc refinery at around 4 a.m. local time. Russian officials stated on social media that an unmanned aerial vehicle had crashed into the facility and stated that there was no material damage or loss of life or fire. Russian officials added that the apparatus that fell from the UAV was destroyed with explosives around 9:20 local time for security reasons. Local officials claimed that the drone attack also caused the fire. In addition, drone attacks on the Ilsc refinery on May 4th and May 5th were reported by the Russian authorities. The attacks caused massive fires at the facility in addition to the attacks at the Yuzhuki oil refinery. Russian authorities announced that another shelling hit the town of Shebekino, just 7 kilometers north of the Ukrainian border. Vyacheslav Gladkov, the governor of the Belgorod region where the town is located, reported that 4 people were injured in Shebekino after the bombing. All these striking offensive operations were described as resounding actions aimed at severing Russian logistics from Crimea and Russian cities. The Ukrainians were advancing successfully on a strategic war plan. On the other hand, there have been increasing reports of attacks on rail networks and oil refineries on Russian soil in recent weeks. This time, drone attacks were also reported in various regions of Russia, including the oil units of the Druzhba pipeline refinery. In the Tver region, the attacks were also touted as a sign of Ukraine's upcoming major offensive. Russian President Vladimir Putin has begun to increase the deployment of air defense systems and other security measures against the attacks of the Ukrainians on Russian cities and Crimea as part of their grand offensive plans. But these measures did not stop the Ukrainian forces. Many Russian-controlled settlements continued to be attacked during the cross-border operational phase of the Ukrainian armed forces. Major offensive plans. The most striking of these attacks was the massive explosions in Crimea. As is known, Crimea is critical for Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. An oil tank in the Cossack Bay in Sebastopol, the target of the first attack in Crimea, turned into a blazing inferno. Regarding the first attack in the Cossack Bay in Sebastopol, the Ukrainian military secret service claims that 10 oil tanks with a capacity of 40,000 tons were rendered unusable in the attack. This figure is a very serious loss for Russia. After this attack, the second airstrike in Crimea alarmed the Kremlin even more. The target of the second airstrike was the port of Taman, near the strategically important Kerch Strait bridge that connects Russia with Crimea. An oil storage tank caught fire in the village of Volna, near the port of Taman. Volna is Russia's only land link with the illegally annexed Crimean peninsula. Also, this city is located near the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is an important supply route for Russian forces in the midst of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Therefore, this situation may disrupt the connection and logistics of Crimea and Ukraine for Russia. In summary, the course of the war has changed drastically thanks to the offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Free Russian Legion groups and volunteer units fighting for Kiev. The atmosphere of anxiety and panic spreading in Russia seems to increase in the future. The reason for this was the very critical breaking point in the war and the plans of the Ukrainian armed forces to increase their attacks on Russian cities and the Crimean peninsula. It seems that Ukraine's attacks targeting important supply lines will wear out Russian logistics. Logistics is the most important vein that feeds a war. It is not possible to talk about the military success of an army whose core is damaged. Moscow's chances are dwindling as Ukrainians also target oil facilities in Russian cities and Russian military facilities on the Crimean peninsula. We look forward to seeing what will happen when Russian leader Vladimir Putin feels the effects of the war in his own country and in the Crimean peninsula, which he wants to keep under control. Tensions between the US and Russia have escalated while the whole world was waiting for the war between Russia and Ukraine to end. The war between the US and Russia has begun. The US Air Force shot down Russian leader Vladimir Putin's favorite fighter jet in the Baltic Sea. The US, which has been providing military equipment and financial support to the Ukrainian army since the beginning of the war, has come face to face with Russia in recent weeks. Tensions between the US and Russia have increased after a US Air Force drone was shot down in the Black Sea. The Russian government initially denied shooting down the US drone. However, the US government proved that Russian warplanes had shot down the US drone, with images obtained from the wreckage of the downed drone. A few days after this incident, the Pentagon decided to send US warplanes to the Baltic Sea. US officials warned the Finnish government after Russian President Vladimir Putin began deploying troops to the Finnish border after Finland's accession to NATO. Vladimir Putin began to deploy troops and tanks to the Finnish border. Not only that, Putin sent Russian Navy ships to the port of St. Petersburg and started making threatening moves against Finland. The US government took action after Finnish President Sauli Niinisto said that the Russian army was very close to the Finnish border and he was worried that Vladimir Putin might attempt a new invasion. With the order of U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Tu-52H fighter jets of the U.S. Air Force moved towards the Baltic Sea. The American warplanes, which were sent to locate the Russian Navy ships anchored in the Baltic Sea, were exposed to the threat of the Russian Air Force. The U.S. warplanes, which entered the radar of the Russian air defense systems, alarmed Russia with the order of the Russian Defense Ministry as U-35 fighter jets of the air defense units of the Western Military District took action on the grounds that U.S. warplanes violated Russia's borders. Russian fighter jets approached the U.S. warplanes hovering over the Baltic Sea and called on them to turn back. After this call by the Russian pilots, the U.S. warplanes left the Baltic Sea and moved away from the region. The Russian Defense Ministry later said in a statement that they did not allow the violation of Russia's borders and that they had to repel the U.S. warplanes in accordance with international rules. However, the harassment of U.S. aircraft by Russian warplanes was not welcomed by the U.S. Defense Ministry. A few days after this incident, the U.S. Air Force F-35 fighter jets destroyed a Su-35 fighter jets of the Russian Air Force. The F-35 fighter jets, the most popular fighter jets of the U.S., are known as stealth fighters. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that U.S. planes sent for reconnaissance in the past days were harassed by Russian fighter jets, but this time they will organize a reconnaissance flight in the region with F-13 fighter jets, stating that they will not allow Vladimir Putin's aggressive behavior against Finland, which is on the way to becoming a NATO member country. The U.S. Defense Secretary stated that they have to monitor the movements of the Russian army shortly after the defense minister's statement. 35 fighter jets moved towards the Baltic Sea. 3 F-35 fighter jets entered the Baltic Sea airspace and started flying near Finland and Russia. American pilots saw Russian Navy ships leaving the port of St. Petersburg and realized that Russian ships were anchored off the coast of Finland, while the U.S. pilots were reporting the situation. And as U-35 fighter jet of the Russian Air Force suddenly appeared, the Russian Su-35 fighter jet, which was chasing the U.S. warplanes, told the U.S. pilots that they had violated the border and asked them to leave the area quickly. Although U.S. warplanes fly in international airspace, Russia does not want U.S. warplanes in the Baltic region. US pilots who refused to leave the region were subjected to harassment by the Russian fighter jet. The Russian pilot, flying very close to the U.S. warplanes, caused the U.S. pilots to lose patience, unable to withstand the harassment of the Russian fighter jet any longer. The American pilots used jammers to disrupt the Russian fighter jets' radar, vision, and systems. The Russian pilot was forced to land at the military airport in St. Petersburg after the systems failed. However, the Russian pilot had problems landing on the runway due to the jammer used by the U.S. fighter jets. The Russian fighter jet, whose landing gear did not work, had to crash on the runway. The Russian fighter jet, which drifted on the runway for a long time, was able to stop by hitting the sand at the end of the runway. After the plane crashed, the Russian pilot barely saved himself from the flames. After the Russian fighter jet crashed, U.S. fighter jets left the Baltic Sea and returned to the U.S. airspace. Russian media reported that the Su-35 fighter jet was shot down by the U.S. and that the U.S. was trying to start a war with Russia. However, it was the Russian fighter jet that first harassed the U.S. fighter jets. The jammer used by the American pilots damaged the landing gear of the Russian fighter jet, causing it to crash. Many war analysts say this was deliberate and that the U.S. retaliated after Russia shot down a U.S. drone. While the whole world was waiting for the war between Russia and Ukraine to come to an end, such a move by the U.S. surprised everyone. Although the U.S. has provided many military equipment support for the Ukrainian army, this is the first time it has officially damaged a Russian military vehicle. Could the ongoing conflict between the U.S. and Russia be the beginning of a new war? Expert researchers say that a third world war is inevitable if tensions between the U.S. and Russia continue. This time, however, the war will not only be between the U.S. and Russia, but between all allies. If the U.S. goes to war with Russia, NATO member states will also have to get involved. However, many believe that Russia is too weak to fight another war. The Russian army, which has occupied Ukrainian territory for more than a year, has lost more than 165,000 soldiers. The Russian army, which has lost military equipment such as many tanks, armored vehicles, and ammunition, is quite exhausted. According to allegations, the Russian army has consumed more than 50% of its ammunition inventory. In fact, Russia's request for military equipment support from allied countries such as Iran, Syria, and Belarus proves this. In addition, the Russian people are not ready for another war. While the majority of Russian citizens want the Russian army to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, it seems unlikely that Vladimir Putin will go to war with America. The recent explosions and fires in Russia are also putting Vladimir Putin under a lot of pressure. While the Russian people's trust in Putin is decreasing over time, the Russian leader is trying to regain the trust of the Russian people. However, after the recent allegations that a new mobilization decision will be announced in Russia, the Russian people are in a very uneasy situation. Putin, who forcibly included 300,000 Russian citizens in the Russian army in the previous partial mobilization decision, now wants to include 500,000 more Russian citizens in the Russian army by declaring a full mobilization decision. But if this happens, it will lead to a major uprising in Russia. Do you think Vladimir Putin can afford a new uprising of the Russian people in the streets? The heaviest battles continue to take place in the east. Today, the Ukrainians launched a series of counterattacks to prevent the Russians from establishing their positions on the newly captured territories in Yakovlivka and Belgorod and even Barentsovo. The latest reports suggest that the counterattack was very intense and that the Ukrainians even engaged their aviation, which they previously didn't do very often in the east. As a result, the Russians did not establish their positions and the situation continues to be very fluid, which is good for the Ukrainians. And here is why. Yesterday I told you that by achieving limited success in Belgorod, the Russians got an opportunity to outflank the Ukrainians in Yakovlivka. Russian sources claim that this village was completely captured by the Russians. Today, this news was at least partially confirmed by Ukrainian sources that reported about a Ukrainian counterattack in this region. Firstly, the Ukrainians conducted an airstrike by engaging several helicopters. Secondly, the clashes were also reported on the ground. However, it is unclear whether a ground attack was launched from the northern part of Yakovlivka or from outside the village. In any case, the village is now not considered as Russian-controlled, but as a green zone instead, which means two things. Firstly, the Russians will unlikely be able to immediately develop their offensive further. And secondly, the Ukrainians have a greater chance of restoring control over it, as the Russians neither established their positions inside the village nor cleared it. This is extremely important because until the village is cleared, the Russians cannot use some parts of the village for defense, as there can be mines and booby traps. The Ukrainians in turn know the placements of these traps and can leverage their knowledge and try to enter the village through the most dangerous parts that the Russians tried to avoid and therefore leave vulnerable. Simultaneously, fights broke out in Belgorod and Barentsovo. When it comes to Belgorod, control over the administrative region is not too important. Yes, by controlling the village underneath the forest, the Russians limit the mobility of Ukrainian troops. However, they do it at a great cost. Due to the geography, the Ukrainians can easily support their positions in the forest from Vinka, and having positions in the forest give the Ukrainians a tactical advantage. First of all, it is very hard for the Russians to penetrate this area. Secondly, the forest is located at a higher altitude relative to Belgorod. All of that facilitates Ukrainian counterattacks, which they also conducted today. But this was only the first line of attack. The second line of attack was opened in the direction of Barentsovo due to the fact that the Ukrainians controlled the three belts that go along the railways and conceal any movement in the lowlands of YMCA. The Ukrainians can easily use the element of surprise when attacking Barentsovo. Still, I do not think that the main goal here was to establish control over Barentsovo. Rather, it looks like an attempt to fix Russian forces in one place while the Ukrainians conduct their main operations in other places. In this particular case, the Ukrainians are fixing Russian forces to prevent flank attacks towards Belgorod and Spirin. Spirner was another active zone today because here the Ukrainians tried to push the Russians from energy facilities located to the west of the road. And some sources mention that this attack was successful. Overall, the front line to the north of Bakhmut becomes hotter. The Russians are trying to create tactical gains that they can leverage to create more tactical gains because the gruesome fights in the southern part of the city cost too many lives for very meager progress. The Russians tried to avoid these expensive fights for big towns by cutting off critical ground lines of communication, reducing supplies and forcing the Ukrainians to step back from their positions on their own accord rather than by being actively pushed out of positions. So far, the Ukrainians continue to hold key positions and inflict losses on their attackers. So we'll see how the situation develops from here.